Now the question is how and when exactly those methods will be involved. Well, for that, let's jump into the directive source code. Here's the code of the form control name directive. And as I said, it extends the ng-control abstraction as well as ng-model and form control directives. So everything I'm going to show you here is the same for those two directives as well. Everything starts in the directive constructor by injecting the value accessor via dependency injection. Every value accessor should reside on the same node with the ng-control directive and has a provider for the ng-value accessor token. Otherwise, the Angular dependency injection will not be able to resolve it. And the default value accessor has a provider for this token. You can see it right here, and also you can see that this token points out this directive class instance. Good. Then, there might be provided more than one provider for the ng-value accessor token, so that's why it is being resolved as an array of value accessors. Though there can be provided many accessors, the ng-control can use only one of them. And in order to resolve this exact accessor, the select value accessor helper function is being utilized. But what it does? It does a quite simple thing. It checks if the value accessor array provided is actually a valid value. Then it sorts accessors into three groups: default accessor, built-in accessor, and custom accessor. After that, it returns the final resolved accessor in the following priority. If the custom accessor was found in providers, then this accessor will be used by ng-control. If not, there will be picked the built-in accessor. And if both were not found, then there will be used the default one. Otherwise, if none of those three is provided, then you will get an error in the development mode and the function will return null. In our case, the default accessor is provided, so it will be used as an accessor right here. Alright, now we know how the accessor is being resolved. Now let's figure out how it is being used. The first kind of meeting between the form control model and the value accessor happens when the control is being set up. If it is not a standalone form control, the ng-control delegates the control setup to the form, which can be represented either by ng-form or form group directives. And it happens by calling the ng-control method and providing self as an argument using this keyword. Inside the add-control method happens actual setup by calling the helper function called setupControl and providing as an argument the control that is associated with this directive and the directive itself. And there happens the most interesting part. And immediately you can see how happens the initial synchronization between the form control model and the native control by calling the right value of the value accessor and providing the value of the model as an argument. What is happening there? I hope you remember. Inside the right value method, we just update the value property of the element to the new value which has been provided to this method, right? So our input element gets the same value as it is defined in the form control model, and in such a way synchronizing the value state between those two. Then here down below you can see that if the form control model is disabled, then happens also synchronization of disabling state by calling setDisableState method. And this method knows already how the DOM element should be updated in order to disable the user input for this control. But synchronizations we just saw, they're happening during the initialization, right? However, the state of form control might change during its life cycle. So there must be some listeners, right? And there are such listeners. Here you can see three functions that have suffixes pipeline in their name and the one that doesn't follow this convention, but it is also a listener that does synchronization of disabled state when it is changed. The first pipeline listens for value changes on the view side and synchronize it with the model. The second one listens for the value changes on the model side and does synchronization with the view. Basically the same as we saw right here. Then there is a blur pipeline listener that is responsible for the synchronization of the touched state. And the last but not least, the disable state change listener that I have already mentioned. Now, I think it would be interesting to have a look at their implementations, right? First, let's have a look at the listener that does value synchronization from the model to the view. Here you can see the onChange function that contains the call of value accessor's write value method and calls view to model update for template driven forms to emit ng model change event. This callback is being registered for the corresponding form control using the register onChange method, and it will be called each time the value changes on the form control model side. We can make sure in it if we check the implementation of form control model. Here you can see this register onChange method, which pushes our callback to the dedicated array, and then when we set a new value for the form control, it goes through the array of callbacks and calls them in a sequence and in such a way executing this logic right here. And by the way, the register onChange method is a part of the public API of form control model, so you can create and register some additional callbacks that will be executed in addition to this one. But yeah, let's move forward, and this is how works the listener, which synchronizes the model value with the view. Now let's have a look at the rest of the listeners. For instance, a similar way works the disable change handler. It checks if the value accessor has a corresponding method. Then there will be created a callback that calls the value accessor's set disabled state method and registers this callback function for the control. After that, this callback will be called every time when models enable and disable methods are called. I hope it is pretty much clear so far. The next pipeline I'm going to show you is the one that synchronizes changes from the view side with the form control model, and it is called setup view change pipeline. The logic here is quite simple as well, and it can remind you the implementation for the previous two pipelines. However, this time callbacks are registered not on the form control model side, but on the value accessors one. If you remember, this is exactly the function that we receive as an argument for the register onChange callback, assign it to the directive class property, and call it when the value of the input changes. In the case of input, it happens when the user types a new value, obviously. So this function that was a black box for us before is exactly this one. This is how it is implemented. So let's have a closer look to it. First, it is a closure function because it captures the control instance that corresponds to this exact value accessor in its body, so to say. And when this callback is called, the control gets a new value, it is being marked as changed, and it is being marked as dirty. Pay attention here that so far they are in pending state, so they are not the actual form control values yet. It is because we have multiple update strategies, if you remember. There is a change strategy that forces the control model to be updated immediately, but there is also a blur strategy that updates the model only when we mark form control as touched. And there is also a submit strategy that forces the form control value to be updated only when we submit the form. So when the update strategy is changed, then the pending value immediately turns into the actual value, which is happening inside the update control function right here. You can see that there we call the set value of the form control model and provide the pending value. But if the strategy is different from change, then it will be updated when the control gets touched or when the form is submitted. You can think about that as a git and git commit. Yeah? You work with some files, edit them, and it is kind of pending state, and then at some point you do commit in order to fix those changes, right? Here something similar happens. Yeah, the pending values, those are kind of your changes, and the update control function is kind of git commit command. But yeah, I hope it is clear, and let's move forward. Here the last but not least is the blur pipeline, which synchronizes the touched state. The logic here is very similar to the previous one. Again, a corresponding value accessor's method register on touched is called, and some callback is provided as an argument. This callback is saved by value accessor into some property, and it is being called when the control is supposed to be touched. Yeah, as it happens right here when the input blur event is fired. Once the callback is called, the control gets touch status, but again in the pending mode, and there you can see the model value fixation if the strategy is on blur, and here happens marking the control as touched, calling the corresponding method. So this is how things work internally, and I hope I could make the internal magic a bit clearer for you, but if you didn't understand something, I'm pretty sure it will get clearer when we start implementing a custom value accessor.